Welcome back to another episode of the Styleframe Saturdays podcast, where great motion design starts with one favorite frame and the fresh ideas behind it. I'm your host, Caroline Lee, and today we're joined by Toros Kose, a director and designer of motion. Toros, thank you so much for joining me on the show. How's everything going?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you recently came back from Off Festival. So speaking of motion design, you were really sort of in the middle of one of our motion design big event conferences. How was it? How was everything there?
It was awesome. It was, longer story short, it was, the conference was pretty busy, pretty packed. I guess it was sold out. Lots of good talks. I sort of attended the conference, but I spent more time just catching up with friends and hanging out in the city, and the weather was perfect the whole time. And yeah, it was a great time.
Yeah, no, what more could you ask for? Great conference, great company, great city in a great part of the world. So, sounds like a wonderful time. Well, before we dive into the project portion of the show, I'd love for our audience to learn a little bit more about you first. So for those who may be unfamiliar with you and your work, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the field of motion design?
I guess it started for me as a hobby for video editing. I think that started even back in high school. I started playing around with, I think the first software I started with was Windows Movie Maker, and then jumped over to Sony Vegas, which I think still is around, making sort of like little personal music videos using movies or trailers or video game content. And then I went to university for a couple of years doing like a broad sort of media education where you sort of dip your toes into anything from like coding and project management to graphic design and video editing. And I was more introduced there to the like Adobe suite, but I also started to introduce myself to After Effects and Cinema 4D. And I think that's when Nick Campbell, Grayscale Gorilla, and Video Copilot started their content. So I started learning from them basically. And then after that, I did a year at it's a vocational school called Hyper Island, and they have a dedicated motion graphics program, which I did. And that program ends with, back then it was only 1 year. I think it's 2 years now, but that program ends with an internship. You don't finish the program until you've done a 3-month internship. And I ended up doing that internship in New York, where I'm still based. Yeah, so that's how I got my foot in the industry. I did a 4-month internship here in New York, and then I did another 3-month internship in Hamburg in Germany. And then I came back to New York and did a year-long internship. So I did 3 internships back to back. And then the studio that I did the last internship at closed. But I was also already interested in freelancing. So basically after that, I started freelancing and have been freelancing since then.
Wow, that's amazing. Real quick, I don't know if you mentioned where you studied university. Was that here in the States or was that over in Europe?
That was also in Stockholm. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden.
Okay. Okay, cool. Oh, very nice. Wow. So you sort of, studied pretty much all the different sort of elements that make up motion design, and then came across a pond and did a few internships in a row, and you just fell right into it. Fell into freelancing from the start too, which is amazing too. You don't really hear that at first, but you hear some people start out as staff and then make their way into freelance. So that's really cool too. And you kept it up ever since.
Yeah. To be fair, all of those internships were kind of like staff positions, like short staff positions.
Sure.
I've never really experienced a bad internship in terms of like go make coffee for the seniors or anything. It's like the first studio that I interned at was it was like a handful of people. And so they need, help. It was me and another classmate who did our internships there. And we knew some After Effects and cinema. So, we were capable enough to help out. So they just threw us onto projects and helped them pitch and produce stuff.
That's amazing.
Same with the other internships as well. So they've kind of felt like staff positions in a sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's awesome. Well, I know on your website, you talk about a lot of the different work that you've done over the years, from sort of like, film and, product-based stuff to tech and UI and everything. So, I'm so eager to, jump into your favorite frame here because, obviously it falls into one of those categories. But could you give us an overview of the frame that you're going to be sharing with us, as well as the larger project that it's a part of?
Yeah. The favorite frame is a part of a pitch and production process for the work that I did with a great team, a small team for the movie Blade Runner 2049, the sequel to the original Blade Runner. And the studio that I did it through is called Prodigal Pictures, and they're out on the West Coast. The owner and the guy who started is someone named Danny Yount, who is basically a mentor, a huge inspiration, and an amazing creative director. So I got to work with him, and I think it was like a few other freelancers. And Danny just reached out one day, kind of out of the blue, and asked if I wanted to help pitch. It started as a pitch on Blade Runner, and I of course said yes. So yeah, this favorite frame is part of the pitch. We didn't end up producing it's a pitch for the title sequence. We ended up making the title sequence, but we didn't use this specific concept. But this frame and this sequence of frames is, I think, at least some of the favorites of what I ended up producing for this project.
Very cool. Well, I know you said that this set of frames and this frame in particular, weren't part of the sort of like final sequence itself. But, when Danny approached you and these handful of other, freelancers for the job, was there any kind of like sort of creative brief that he shared with you for to sort of kick off the project? Or was it really just like, we're pitching for the new Blade Runner movie, and, he kind of had the sort of idea or direction for you guys from the start?
This was back in late 2017, so I tried actually going back and find the emails, but I couldn't find too much about like creative briefs. But from what I remember, it was pretty minimal and pretty vague. I want to say, and I don't think this is like me constructing in hindsight, but I want to say it had they gave us certain themes, and I think one of the themes were identity,
okay.
Which makes sense that the movie deals a lot with the concept or the idea of identity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think apart from that, it was pretty minimal, and I don't think they gave us that much to go on. They gave us some footage from the film, but it was it felt pretty random, what they gave us, and so okay, it's super cool seeing this movie before it's finished, but I'm not sure what to do with it. And I think from what I can remember, Danny had come out with some loose concepts that also sort of fit our individual styles and strengths, which is why I ended up making we also pitched on the studio logos that go in the beginning of the movie, the Warner Brother logo and the other studios that are in there. And I did a whole sequence of frames for that logo treatment, which we ended up also actually producing this monochromatic, glitched, distorted treatment that we gave it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you were sort of aware of what the movie was probably about, but if you weren't and you were jumping onto this project, did Danny share with you, sort of a quick synopsis of what the movie was about, or was there anything like that kind of sort of helped inform sort of the kickoff for concept and visuul direction?
I don't remember getting a synopsis from Danny or anyone else, so okay. It was pretty in the dark, to be honest.
Okay.
So I guess we got sort of lucky and played hunches and intuition and that kind of stuff, and obviously some concepts missed the mark, but a couple hit pretty well. And I think there were certain elements of the stuff that I did that sort of surprised the director in a positive way, and we ended up going in that direction. But yeah, it was loose. It was a bit of a chaotic project. We didn't have that much time. I think we had a month and a half maybe to pitch and then produce the stuff that we ended up winning.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, wow. Talk about a quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds, so like you're saying, it was a loose sort of brief, if you will, for the project. I'm curious, what's sort of your go-to technique or ritual when you're first starting out in sort of this early ideation phase of a project? What's the first Toros thing that starts sort of the whole process for you?
I think often, and at least for this project, it's because we weren't given that much, we sort of have to make stuff up and imagine things that would fit in the world. And I guess we were sort of trying to imagine what a sequel to the original Blade Runner would look like, and what it would involve. Obviously, the whole human and android theme, that whole concept is pretty obvious, and then we also lean into it. I'm leaning into it pretty heavily in that favorite frame and that whole sequence of frames. I think usually I do start with writing down ideas and just sort of organizing what's loosely in my head into words and different loose ideas or concepts. I guess sort of starting with loose ideas and then crystallizing them a bit more into a single concept or multiple concepts. And then sort of in tandem with that, I like to start looking for reference, do the good old fashioned Pinterest and other sources, books sometimes. But yeah, try to just pair my written concepts with visual concepts and just look for inspiration and sort of, hope for that something will strike a chord and give you more ideas, basically.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, Pinterest seems to be a favorite among some of us motion designers. I know I definitely, refer to it from time to time too. But it's very cool to hear though that you're actually starting out with just sort of like writing, just purely writing, not even like sketching, just starting out with like sort of some written stuff, call it a treatment if you want or something like that, to just get a loose idea out there and then, dive into sort of like, some inspiration with Pinterest and various tools like that. What were some of the inspirations for this concept and story that you guys were building?
Pretty naturally, like again, that sort of android and human and organic in that world of like technology has advanced so much that they can essentially print humans. They're not human, but they're essentially almost human, and the movie deals with like where is the threshold of like what is a human and what's not a human. But it of course like gives you a lot of ideas in terms of like organic imagery, bodies and nerves and muscles and all that stuff, fluids. So I think we definitely one of the directions that we started digging into and looking for reference and playing with ideas was that direction. I think I remember now. I think by the time that we started this pitch, I think the first trailer had also come out,
Okay.
I think, which was very helpful because there are at least one or two scenes in that trailer where the main character is walking through like this orange, it's like the image or the moment for that movie. He's walking through this like foggy orange desert scene. I think it's like Las Vegas after the calamity that's happened in the story. So that also gave us a lot of visual ideas in terms of like atmosphere and sand, like using sand in our. I did end up making a few style frames like with the logos, the Warner Brother logos, for instance, like sort of half buried in sand. I'm losing track of your question at this point.
I guess I was just saying you said, sometimes, I'll start out with writing and then I'll start diving into like the world of like Pinterest to sort of like, figure out, maybe get some like, visual inspiration, if you will. So I was just curious, like what were some of those sources of inspiration? But it kind of sounds like the trailer was probably one of the main ones, right?
It did a lot of like mood setting and setting up the tone of the film. Mm-hmm. Pretty slow and very atmospheric. So that definitely helped us for sure with imagery and vibe, basically. And mood.
Yeah. No, definitely. Well, and I know sometimes film, there can be some sort of like branding or IP constraints or just like, constraints from like the director and whoever's working on the film too, like how much did that sort of like play into your sort of like early ideation and concept development? Like, did that influence any of your ideas this early on, or were you just purely in sort of a pure exploration phase?
Yeah, it was pretty exploratory for sure. I don't remember getting any direction from the director. We were casting a wide net basically and hoping for the best basically. Looking back at some of the emails, apparently the producer of the film or one of the producers of the film didn't like some of the concepts. I think he or she felt like it would be too involved, but they ended up getting presented anyway, which was great because apparently the director, Denis, ended up liking the concepts.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, it was a wide net. It was like, let's just try every single idea we can come up with, at least make some style frames for each one and see what sticks.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And you had like a short time to sort of do all that too. So I feel like if it were me, and you could comment on this, from your perspective, I'd feel like, wow, like we can really do anything that we want with this. Like, where do I start? So like, for you, if you had any of those thoughts running through your mind, like where did you start? Like, how did you know like where to start from a visual development perspective? Like once you gathered all this inspiration, it was a wide casted net. How did you sort of make the decision like, okay, I'm going to go in this direction?
That's a good question. I think the the tasks that Danny had prepared, which were fairly loose, but they were at least some kind of direction that helped. The ideas and images that I had collected to that point also helps. I mean, the way I use reference often, and I'm sure this is a common way of working, is you sort of find your hero images or hero reference images. And then a good starting point, I think, is essentially to like not recreate or copy, but like use one or two images as a starting point. And then together with your written concepts and ideas, that sort of like to sort of merge the two and yeah, basically start sketching with those things in mind. Yeah, basically like melding these few things that you're given, and essentially just experiment and play around the first few days and see what works, see what doesn't work. I think a lot of it is, hopefully you're giving somewhat of enough time to get like bad ideas out.
Mm-hmm.
Those tend to come first often. So it's hopefully you have at least like a day to just like get the crap out first, and then usually the good stuff comes after. Yeah.
That's true. It's like, you need to have that like sort of like, going for a walk or shower moment where you're sort of like, like, oh, there's the light bulb. That's where I know I'm going to go with this whole thing.
Yeah, sure. A shower and walk, or just bashing your head against.
That works too. Well, you're now that we're sort of talking about the, the beginnings of like, sort of the visual coming together, like obviously you knew what the movie was about, the theme of it and everything, what was the sort of, I guess, like core emotion or tone that you were trying to sort of like set with this sort of like direction that you were going in?
I think we were probably pulling a lot of the tone from the trailer and the pieces of footage that we did receive. I remember one of the scenes that we received footage from was the baseline test, they call it in the film, where the Ryan Gosling's character is just sitting in this sterile room and is being questioned these like kind of strange questions, which in the movie is created to sort of test his emotional response after a potentially traumatic event. But it was very cool, actually. Like I remember watching those because we were given that footage out of context. We just got this like one scene. We got a couple of other ones, but out of context, they were like, especially that scene was kind of really strange and had this strange mood to it. But also the trailer of like Gosling's character walking through that desert and that sort of like heavy vibe. Kind of like a Dune vibe almost. Because it's the same director. But the trailer, I think, like trying to match the tone and the mood of the trailer was probably an aim. I can't remember exactly what I was thinking, but probably something like that. Yeah.
No, that's very cool. Yeah, no, it's a very futuristic, sort of sci-fi looking frame, and then sets of frames. Obviously, the film is too. And I know you've worked on a lot of like, sort of futuristic looking, sort of like visual stuff. When you're working on sort of this sort of style for whether it be film or products or whatever, like how do you make sure that you're still injecting sort of a sense of like a human element, like humanity into it? How do you make it so that, the frames don't just look cool, because they do look cool, they're really cool, but like how do you also make them just still feel very human?
Yeah, that's tricky. Obviously, like having organic elements in there helps. Like that favorite frame is basically a hand being taking shape. So that definitely helps. What you're talking about is harder, I would say, with more like techie elements or like data elements, which this concept has some of that. And those are actually my least favorite frames from this concept. Looking back, I was thinking the other day, like, oh, we should have leaned just fully into that orange organic stuff. But I think back then I was trying to balance up like the sort of data screen scene with the organic scenes. But other than that, I think I tend to lean a lot into things that we as people can relate to. Like many of us can relate to like looking through a camera or film in general, and cameras and film, they have a certain look, and even our eyes have like can create, if you focus on something close by, everything else gets blurred, shallow depth of field, and sort of softening up the image a bit using film grain and texture. I think those are all like layers that make a style frame a bit more human, I guess, or relatable.
Yeah, no doubt. No, it's just purely like mimicking reality. I mean, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I could totally see that. That's very cool. Well, and you're touching on a little bit of some of the color sort of choices that I guess you were making as you were doing the pitch side of the project. Yeah, some of these frames are like very skewed warm orange in tone, and then some of them are a lot cooler. Like what were some of sort of the choices behind going in one direction versus the other?
I'm pretty sure again it was a trailer. That moment of him walking through the desert was such a striking visual moment, but also like what made sense for us, trying to create this abstract environment of an android being created, of like almost like in a huge womb or something, and it just made sense to use those warm tones. I think probably felt a bit more cinematic and closer to the film. Yeah, and like the androids in the film are essentially almost human, and there's a big question in the film of like it seems like some of the androids have even become human in the sense that they're able to like reproduce. I think it just made sense to sort of make that creation process look as natural and human and organic as possible, and the sort of the warm tone and warm looking space made more sense. You sort of wanted to mimic the sort of organic fluid and nerves, like actual nerves being created, and use essentially human flesh and the human body as a reference.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and it kind of sounds like you're thinking a little bit about sort of the animation side too. Like I know you're, at this moment purely designing, but it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like even you're thinking about the animation and how that maybe that's even influencing some of your design choices too, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially with a short timeline like this, it is often in the back of my mind, at least, that like this will need to be produced and animated if it gets accepted. So also just for my own sanity, I like to design. Basically, the designs are set up to be animated. Often they are even created using keyframes, so they are almost, or often they are animated, at least to like a basic extent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like just we can go into technicals a little bit, like the
Sure.
that a lot of those frames that look like nerves and stuff being created. I use X particles
Okay.
for to create those lines, and so you basically have to animate those nerves growing while you're designing, and then basically pick good looking moments and angles. So yeah, I do think a lot. I think I've pretty much always thought about animation to some degree when I design, even back when I was interning, because it's
Yeah.
like this is pretty much all projects are fast paced and need to be produced. And back when I started, it was still sort of this workflow of the designer creates the style frame in Photoshop, and then the animators have to figure out how to recreate that and animate it. And that seemed even back then like a clunky, inefficient way of doing it. And I never really got into designing my style frames in Photoshop. I often design straight in After Effects. I'm not a good illustrator. That probably has something to do with it too. But I was just more comfortable in After Effects. And yeah, I think that's sort of that mindset stuck around, and sort of designing for animation was it's definitely a
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you're, if you do the motion work too, I mean, like, it just makes sense that you would kind of like fall into that rhythm,
yeah.
naturally. Yeah. Oh, for
The
sure.
animators too. Even if you're just designing, you want the animators to be your friend.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, you want to make sure when you pass them off, someone's not sort of like, oh my God, why did he do it this way? Why are there a million layers of 13, 14, 15? Yeah. No, for sure. Well, and if now that you're even thinking about sort of animation while you're designing too, I'm just curious to hear from you as well. Is something like final sound playing a role in any of your like early design choices too? Or like, I know again you keep saying, we're referencing the trailer
Mhm.
while you're working on these, but like, and I know that the trailer probably has sort of its own sort of soundscape to it too, aside from the film, but I'm just curious, if that's playing any role in some of these early decisions too.
I don't think it was for this one. The trailer, I remember, had some really cool sound effects, which again helped with the mood and all that.
Yeah.
But I don't think we were thinking about, yeah, for this one, it was just so like open and short time frame that I don't remember remember us having any conversations about sound specifically. I'm not sure how much say we would have had over that too. It was a title sequence, so we would have probably just been visuals, like the animation and music. So I don't think sound would have been a big part of it, if at all, except music.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, not for this one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, you spoke a little bit, a minute ago about how, to sort of replicate sort of that real world realism, cinematic sort of like look and feel to your style frames and everything. I know every artist probably has their own sort of like signature workflow when they're working on this stuff, but I'm just curious, like what's the Toro's key to sort of like cinematic designs? Like what's your go-to sort of like workflow process when you start to really get into like the weeds of this stuff?
I think, and looking at these frames again, and this is still sort of how I like to design and think about it. And I think cinematic often it sort of rests on a few different fundamentals, like good composition and thoughtful use of color or no color, or sparse color, lens choices and all that. But I think composition is a big factor. And looking at these frames is like they're complex, like detailed, but also very minimal, sparse. It's like this. It's a lot of like clean, empty backgrounds with one or two very detailed elements. And I think that might be one way to approach it. I guess it's a bit. Of course, it's all subjective and tastes. But I was actually looking at a video of a street photographer. He's a really awesome street photographer, and that's similar to how he was thinking about it. He was basically he was starting with the background, so he was looking for sort of clean background where his subjects could pop, and then it was just up to him to sort of find a good angle. And so I think looking back, that's how I like to think as well, and at least sometimes it's sort of like create this pretty, I don't know, empty or clean or simple background or backdrop, and then add more complex subjects in front of it. And I feel like, I don't know if that's like a cinematic approach, but I guess it ends up with everything else, with the textures and film grain and all that, it ends up being like becoming a cinematic looking frame, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I love that you touched on the photography because I know you do a little bit of photography yourself too. And I love that you had said that, this one photographer that you were, I guess, looking at his work or whatever, that he sort of focuses on the background first, which I think is a really interesting approach. Like I don't want to speak for other designers or even artists of all different kinds of mediums, but I feel like more often than not, you're sort of focusing on sort of the hero element of the frame or composition at first, right? And you're sort of like kind of building their world around them. But really, I kind of love how he's sort of doing the inverse of that, saying like, like, well, what's the world of this person? And then, just sort of maybe seamlessly put them in there is a very cool way to sort of approach design. I don't know if I've ever thought of that myself. And so, just want to call that out that, I think that that's a really cool sort of piece of advice too, for anyone who's doing some sort of visual storytelling.
Yeah, I don't think I've thought about that myself, really. And we have the luxury as designers in these softwares to just remove the background or replace a layer. But
Mm-hmm.
and of course I do that all the time myself. But it was interesting because he basically thinks like a painter. I think like a lot of like classic painting, they have to start with the background. They
That's
can't
right.
like draw the figure, and then and his, because he's a street photographer, the world is around him is changing constantly, and he's looking for that canvas first, and then he's sort of positioning himself to place the subject in front of the canvas. If he's lucky, because he might not get the shot. But I think the thinking is helpful and definitely applies to our work too. Like it's like sort of like you start with the basics, like the flat canvas, and then you add elements on top of that, and then of course you can replace those and change things. But um, yeah.
Yeah, no, and maybe I'm reading, maybe I'm trying to make a little bit more meaning out of this than there really is too. But it also kind of sounds like you could use it in a way to kind of like step into that the character's world or the protagonist's world too. Like building the environment. What about this feels like it's like appropriate for them to live in? I think again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think it's just kind of a very interesting way to approach visual storytelling. So yeah, very cool, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure we are reading. It might actually be worth thinking about this. Anyway, yeah.
Something we'll have to ponder from going forward for sure. Well, in terms of the sort of speaking of the cinematic look, still, when you're working inside After Effects and everything, you talked about X particles a little bit, like I'm just curious to hear from you from sort of like the technical side. What are some other sort of tools or plugins or expressions that you're using that maybe you heavily rely on that help sort of give that polished cinematic look? Like, are there any that we don't know about that like we should spill the beans on, or?
I don't think so. I am not a very technical designer or motion designer. I like to keep things. I love to keep things simple. I
That's awesome.
The simpler the better for me. And then yeah, it just depends on what the concept is, of course, but it's like two sides of the same coin in a way, because it's like I can only design within my technical abilities as well. They, of course, dictate what my designs look like in the end to some extent. If of course if we have to learn something, we try to do it. There's a tutorial for anything, but yeah, I like to keep things simple. I use Cinema 4D, I use Redshift for rendering, X particles for particles most of the time, and After Effects, and Illustrator, the classic standard stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, and I love that you had also said too that you like to really keep it simple. I mean, truer words have never been spoken. I think, I think when you look at some really great style frames and just really great, motion design pieces out there too, I'm more often than not, I'll bet you it is a more either just like simple approach to, telling the story. Right. And, yeah, as motion designers, we have all these tools at our disposal too. So you could totally get, super excited and lost in the tools themselves too. But, always coming back to sort of like the sort of intentional story to be told is where the magic really lies. So I'm, again, love that you're sort of calling out, like just keep it basic. Photoshop, After Effects, Cinema 4D, just, make sure that, you focus on I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but, just based on what you've said, it kind of sounds like you just really are focusing on even just like the basic design principles too, to tell that story too. Like you were saying, like, a lot of negative space and stuff like that, really to just sort of keep things, the primary thing in focus. So, I just love that too. I couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of time that I think that happens sort of unconsciously, I guess, and it's a sort of I guess, I mean, we all goes in the direction that strikes a chord with us to begin with, at least. And usually, what strikes a chord with me is like simple but striking design, I guess. Yeah, and then that usually ends up leaning on the fundamentals, basics. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, speaking about this a little bit further, you have a page on your website where you talk about sort of like your own tenets, which I loved. I loved, everything that you wrote down there. So everyone should go check that out on Toros's website after they watch the show. But one of your design tenets was to pay attention to what you pay attention to and let that be your guide. I mean, it kind of everything that we've spoken about pretty much sounds like this. So, how, if in regards to this frame in particular, like how did that tenet show up in the creation of this frame?
Uh, to be fair to myself, I wrote that after this project.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Not like directly after in like
Right.
relation, but like years later. That's a good question. I'm not sure, because I have to try to think back on what I thought back then. And we did this project in late 2017, so it's been a while. But that, like, trying to pay attention to what I pay attention to is it's actually just something I've been thinking more and more about in general. And not just for design, I would say, but also for design. It's kind of like how we live in this very content overfilled world in general, and it's like, okay, it is time to pay attention to what we pay attention to, because our attention is a resource, and it's a valuable resource. And back when there wasn't this much stuff to pay attention to, yeah, there wasn't as much that like was trying to grab your attention, and you weren't being like mentally pulled in all these directions. So just for your own like sanity, I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. But I think what I mean in on my website is more when it comes to you as a designer, and like what sparks your interest and your curiosity. And there, I think it's helpful if one can be aware enough of like, oh, I am paying attention to this. How come I'm paying attention to this specific thing, and like, why is that sparking an interest? And that can be a fruitful rabbit hole, basically, when you're designing, for instance. So there's something calling you, I guess.
Yeah, oh, for sure. No, I love that you can apply it to like not just our industry in particular, but broadly as like kind of life advice too. Like, pay attention to what you're paying to. Like you said, I don't, not to sort of businessify, like attention necessarily, but like it's like kind of a form of currency. Like, like that's very, near and dear to us, like what we're paying attention to and how we're using our time. So, I couldn't agree with it even more. So I think it's also great life advice, but also really great design advice too. Like, be curious about what you're curious about, if you want to say it another way too.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, 100%.
Well, looking back on, this project, this frame, these sets of frames, what advice would you give someone who's trying to sort of like emulate this sort of not just tone and look, but just sort of this like same impact, sort of like cinematic, emotional, human impact?
To give you like a short, succinct answer, I would say study like the greats, the best designers. Again, Danny Yount is like, I think everyone should study his work, everyone in motion design. And then the even more obvious answer, I think, is just study classic cinema, classic films. A good starting point, because it's Blade Runner. We're talking about Blade Runner. Is Roger Deakins' cinematography, for instance. I think those are good starting points. Good designers and good cinematographers.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've noticed myself sort of thinking about that a little bit recently too, that, I was like, why do certain sort of like either motion designers or pieces like really sort of like hit home with me? And I think it's, number one underneath it all is just sort of like, the narrative that's being told or the story that's being told. But on top of that, it's, it's not just design, it's cinematography too. And, I am not a cinematographer by background or video person by background. I, went down the sort of animation design path. So that's what I'm mostly familiar with. But the
Mhm.
ones that really sort of jump out at me are really, really play into sort of that cinematography aspect of the motion design sort of world too. So yeah, no, it's great advice. Definitely study. If you have an interest in films in general, just as like pure pleasure, like, yeah, who are the directors behind it, the cinematographers, the DPs, like just get interested in that world because it makes a world of a difference, I think.
Yeah, and I also do want to say that when you're studying the greats, to put it short, I think it's a good exercise to just straight up copy to begin with,
Yeah.
as an exercise. And like, because I think there's learning in just looking at something, but there's more learning, even more looking at something and then try to recreate it, because it's like, yeah, I guess it adds another level of understanding, I guess, in trying to recreate. Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
100%. Yeah, if you start to sort of figure out how to technically figure something out,
yeah, that's
it kind of, doesn't directly put you like in their POV, but it gets you thinking about like, like, oh, maybe this is what they were thinking about when they were building this out or something like that. So yeah, no, that's also great advice too.
yeah, and just like technical problem solving too. That'll
Right.
How do I recreate this? It could be a
100%.
challenge to create a film scene that is not created with VFX, but then try to recreate it in 3D, for instance, as closely and as cinematically as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. For sure. Well, I'd love to sort of continue down this advice path if you don't mind. But for anyone who's listening who wants to sort of improve their creative outputs, whether it's style frames, just motion pieces in general, film, design in general, you name it, what's the biggest mindset shift you'd recommend they make in sort of their ideation and workflow process to make them more effective and make their stories stronger too?
Um, that's a good question. That's a big question.
Yeah, sorry, we can break it down into two parts
Yeah,
if it's a
no,
lot.
it's hard to pinpoint a specific moment, and I'm not sure there was that moment where I'm like, oh, I need to shift the way I approach things and how I think. But there also have been moments. I've been doing this for 15, 16 years now, and I think there have been like moments where I don't know if you could call them thresholds or like milestones.
Yes, yeah.
Then that have been sort of meaningful events in terms of this career or professional life. I don't know if I can like point to like specific learnings and that sort of shifted how I think consciously, but that's also why I picked this project to talk about, because the thinking or in the preparation a little bit for this episode, I went back and thought more about this project, and it struck me. I hadn't thought about it before, but it struck me like the movie. One of the key themes in the movie is identity. The journey that the main character goes through is like he has a big identity crisis essentially in the film. But then we also, the stuff that we design for the film has to do with the identity of the film, like studio logos and the title sequence that adds sort of mood and identity to the film. But also the project for me personally was like a big milestone and a milestone in terms of like professional identity. It was a very meaningful project in many ways. In obvious ways, like it left me with a great portfolio piece that I'm still happy about. I got to work with one of my favorite creative directors, Danny. I got to work on this cool film that turned out to be a good film, which is not very often the case. So it's even for me personally, it was like a big sort of identity moment or step in a sense. I think it's a gradual process, and I think it's always, pretty much always, hindsight 2020 or somewhat 1820. Maybe it's not always clear looking back, but you learn certain. On my most recent project, I feel like I learned certain things on how to work more effectively and do things more effectively, but it's always a process, and I will look back at this project a year from now and realize more things, new things. So yeah, I guess maybe it's not a shift, but it's always good if you can do it and helpful to sort of look back and reflect, basically. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, maybe, mindset shift was maybe not the best sort of word to use for it, because like you had said, what do people need to change about how they're sort of thinking about the projects, and maybe it doesn't need to change. But I think thinking about, okay, where was I 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and
Mhm.
looking back on like how you were approaching work back then, it's maybe just really just the pure reflection of like, oh, I've, technically, started doing this. That's really helped a lot. I worked with so-and-so as a boss or producer or mentor or whatever, and they really sort of like helped me sort of like look at things a different way. So maybe it's really, like reflection. It's like, what's the best way to sort of reflect on these things? And I think you nailed it with that. So that's great. Well, with regards to this frame and these sets of frames, this project that you worked on, what would you say were the biggest challenges and rewards about working on it?
Um, I think the biggest challenge, well, rewards definitely a great project to have worked on, great outcome, both in terms of the pitch process, and then we also got to like produce actual content for the film, the studio logos and the main on end titles, um, and just again having to work with the team. Like, and I think the challenges were, again, mainly the time frame and the not so helpful amount of information that we received, as in very little information. Luckily, ended up fine. But I guess time frame was the biggest one. I actually did a 24-hour shift on for this project, and it was hard, but it was also a cool memory. Like we, did 12-hour, and then I did another 12-hour, and I remember watching the sunset or sunrise in the studio. Well, half asleep, half awake.
Yeah, now that I think about it, some projects where I've pulled an all-nighter or 24-hour period, I'm sort of like, yeah, you know what? Like there's some cool moments around, even just like, even though you're crunching at that moment, just some cool moments around that too. So, it's not all bad when you have to do a 24-hour shift.
Yeah, it's
Well,
also a fun memory looking back.
yeah, no, absolutely. And the people that you're working with too, I mean, makes it all the better as well. You're all kind of like in it together, final push and everything. So no doubt. Well, and you kind of called out this a little bit with the previous question before, sort of the biggest challenges and rewards on this piece, with this being sort of like a milestone moment in your career. But, I always have to ask, what about this frame makes it your favorite frame?
I think of all of those frames, it's just the sort of simplest and cleanest one. It's the one with the director's name on it. But I think that's it. I think I love the simplicity and the sort of this striking nature, and that like simple background, complex foreground object. I think that's it. Yeah, it's sort of like the culmination, I guess, of the sequence.
Definitely. No, that's awesome. Oh, cool. Well, I mean, Toros, I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, but I definitely want to be respectful of our time here today. But it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing your creative processes and workflows with us, as well as this favorite frame. If people want to connect with you to learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
Email or Instagram. I'm on both. I have both.
Okay, great. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be sure to share your information as well as some of the links to the resources we've mentioned here for our audience to check out. But that wraps it up for today, everyone. Feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. And if today's conversation inspired some new takeaways, please drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform as well. And lastly, come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you again, Toros, for joining us today, and we'll see you all in the next one.